Welcome back to Compact Convos. I'm here with Caleb and JT. Say hello, boys.
Hey,
What's up?
Alrighty. So today, I love the enthusiasm and the hellos, by the way. Is today we're going to be talking about logistics. It's an obscure part of most campaigns, not necessarily the battle, but we could probably work something in. But very obscure part of campaigns. Caleb, exactly what are logistics in the campaign?
so logistics, it's an easy way to remember that is, your beans and bullets. This is what you're going to need in order, not for the fight itself, but how you get to the fight. That's kind of how I imagine logistics. It's kind of the unsung hero in the background. Napoleon famously said that an army will march on its stomach. So keeping all of those behind the scenes details in your campaign, otherwise known as logistics, I think that can really add to the realism of a campaign and even in some cases battles.
Yeah, I agree with that. I- Jokingly, at the risk of sounding pretentious, Sun Tzu's big Art of War book is all about teaching dumb people that feeding your troops is very important. While it's difficult to always translate to the tabletop, it's definitely a very important part of that.
I mean, I'd agree from the campaigns we've done. So let's talk about battles real quick because that'll be a much shorter segment on it. But if we wanted to incorporate supplies into battle, think of like Axis and Allies, the Battle of the Bulge. I know Caleb and I have played that one. We have to get supply to move anything. How would you think that would look in a battle itself? Just a tabletop battle, a campaign, not a campaign, an arcade scenario.
Yeah, I think if you're just fighting out just a standard battle, you can have like set conditions that include logistics. I know you mentioned the Axis and Allies board game, where you need to either capture supplies or spend like supply tokens in order to move your units. You can include supply, moving away from board games to like the actual tabletop miniature games. You can include logistics in the fact of let's say half your army hasn't been resupplied, and so now your objective during this battle is to capture an enemy supply depot intact, which will then allow the other half of your army to now come into the battle fully equipped. Another scenario is if you're doing a siege battle, let's say in this scenario on the campaign, I've been shelling this town for 20 turns, but then the umpire comes to me and says, hey, unless you attack this turn, you won't have enough ammunition during the battle. So then during that battle, the umpire might say, hey, you only have 10 turns worth of ammunition during this battle. So you better make your munition count quickly. It's kind of, and a really good example of this is, I'm sure a lot of us have seen I believe it's the 1994 Gettysburg, where, he's saying, if I keep this artillery fire, I'm not going to have enough ammunition to support the infantry advance. So, I mean, that's a real life example that you
Yep.
could reflect onto the tabletop to explain those logistics.
Yeah,
JT.
I think that the best way to kind of nail it is it provides the limitations, right? Because you'd mentioned kind of like the arcade, the kind of more I guess less grounded setting where it's kind of you're just here all of a sudden. Um, it puts that more grounded state to it, um, where you will get, as mentioned earlier, um, different conditions of what's going on. Hey, your troops been marching nonstop for like let's say you're doing Napoleon's invasion of Russia, and maybe you're outside Moscow for whatever reason. Hey, maybe your troops you've already had a lot of guys die. All your troops are starting the battle with one bead, or you have limited ammunition rounds. It's a really good way to help recreate those conditions in a way that feels authentic.
Oh, yeah.
Okay. Is I don't want to jump ahead, but we'll come back to adding the bead there for some consequences. But how do you implement them into the campaign, Caleb? Is you're army's been marching. You're maybe you're under siege, something like that. Can you describe how you would implement them in maybe like a Rev War, Napoleonics, and even Civil War campaign?
Yeah, I know. I know our club's been more mainly relegated to like linear warfare combat. Hopefully, we can branch off into World War II soon. But sticking with that kind of timeline, I really think you can get to as in depth of logistics as you want. But with that being said, you almost have to have an umpire, especially if you're doing a campaign. You have two opposing players. You need that third player, the umpire, to manage those logistics. He's the one saying like, okay, let's say Boston is under siege. This is how many turns of supply Boston has. As far as implementing it in the campaign, you can keep it as vague as, okay, hey, during the winter, troops can't move without suffering, one beat of damage to their army, to each unit. So you can keep it simple like that to manage, those kind of attriting effects of logistics, but perhaps having a lack of food, lack of winter clothing. But you can also get into so in depth as, okay, now every single army has an ammunition count. This army's been, cut off on every road, but maybe a supply wagon got on at the last second. So that means instead of having 5 points of supply, now you have 6 points of supply. You can get into the point where, okay, if my army's out of port, and it's not blockaded by the enemy, I can, I'm not receiving any logistical impact. So logistics can get as wild or as simple as the umpire wants it in a campaign. But I think in order to wage a campaign, and our goal being that the commander needs to feel that realism of command, the same issues. I think in order to wage an actual, like, good, realistic campaign, you need some element of logistics in it. What do you think, JT?
Yeah, I agree with you completely. An example I like to use is there's a board game called Campaign in North Africa, which is so painstakingly detailed down to making sure you ration out extra water for your Italian troops because their rations include like pasta. That you can, if that's the route you want to go, where you're going to say, okay, we're going to start marking down every single little minute detail, you can. On the other hand, if you want to kind of ignore it altogether, you can. And I think there's kind of a luxury in that, in this aspect more than sometimes others. You can really kind of tailor to your group. Is it something you really want to play around, or do you guys just want to sit down and watch two sides shoot the heck out of each other, over and over again? So I think that's a really up to you how you want to implement it.
So,
Yeah, and if I can jump in right quick.
Oh, yes, sir.
You bring up that case, JT, the North African campaign. You could also think of Napoleon's invasion of Russia once again. Some campaigns you cannot play without having logistics in there, or else that campaign is not going to reflect how the campaign was at all. Some are purely based on logistics, like that North African campaign. So if you're fighting a campaign such as North Africa or Napoleon's invasion of Russia, or even the Pacific theater, like, logistics were perhaps the most essential, but not the battles, really. The logistics were perhaps the hardest battle to fight for those commanders. So just keep that in mind.
Like the first naval invasion, I may be a little off here, so I apologize if someone's going to rip me apart.
I will. Don't
But like
worry.
the first naval, oh thanks, the first naval invasion landing in the Pacific done by the U.S. Like landing was successful. We took the island, but our supply lines were kind of crap. Our supply boats kept getting to the shore. It was too slow. We weren't able to efficiently unload them, and so eventually we had to surrender the island, if I remember correctly. Like we had to come back and redo it again later. So even on a arguably smaller scale like that, you see it everywhere.
Yeah, what they ended up having to do was the supplies would be loaded in a certain order in California, shipped to Hawaii, and or once Guam became a thing again, I think it's Guam anyways, to one of the other islands. They'd ship them there, repackage them as what's known as a combat load. and all that is to make it easier, I think, to get ammunition and then food in that order, followed by what other material they need, flamethrower tank, anything of that nature would
Hmm.
be the last ones to come. But they actually had to combat load the ships. That's probably where we get the term in the military from. And then Nimitz, and I forget what year now because I'm being put on the spot. Nimitz was like, "What is the holdup here?" And it was, I know it was after the Guadalcanal campaign because I think that's the one you're referring to. Is Nimitz was like, "What is going on? Why is this taking so long?" He's listened to everybody, and he's like, "Cool." Calls up, "Hey, you're going to combat load from California, and this is just getting shipped to wherever I really need it to, or it's getting shipped to where they're huddling for the next one." But Caleb, you mentioned logistics in World War II. Literally, it came down to landing craft. Is do we have the landing craft for Nimitz's plan to cut across the Central Pacific, or does it go to MacArthur? And then obviously we were shipping material and personnel out to the Atlantic, the European theater. But most of those boats that we made, they're all driven by British sailors. But back to logistics for tabletopping. Sorry, that was our history lesson right there. Um, Obviously, we kind of just hit it on the head. Umpires extremely important whenever you're doing a campaign, especially for logistics, because the umpire, as we previously stated, should kind of know great detail about the time period that you're conducting the war in. So we kind of already talked about how they impact the campaign with your good examples in our history lesson, and how do we implement them? We kind of talked about that one a bit too, I believe. But any other thoughts on maybe how to implement them as we were talking that popped up in y'all's head?
I
I'd
think
mentioned uh, beads earlier, right?
Oh,
Like that's a good way to do
yes,
it
we're going to get to
in
that one.
a
That's going to be repercussions and consequences.
yeah.
Consequences.
As just a small example, but perhaps if it's a multi-day battle and you're having supply issues, you start um, saying, okay, hey, my artillery maybe only has so many rounds, or my soldiers only got so many shots handed out by this day. They maybe only have 5 rounds left, or something like that. Somewhat morale, depending on if how much you're playing that up in your own campaign, if that's affecting, hey, your guys have barely had food for the past 2 weeks, like nobody's dead,
Maybe some desertion
but
happens at that point.
yeah, maybe some desertion happens at that point. Yeah.
Is so I'll rephrase it then because I guess that goes more with what you were saying. Is you're mentioning more of like the repercussions, the consequences
Hmm.
on the campaign, even over it sounds like multi-day battles with ammo counts or getting there. Caleb, any thoughts?
yeah, I think as far as the implementation goes, I believe that. And we've dealt with this plenty of times. Like the umpire will forget about the small things because the umpire is worrying about where all these troops are moving, where the battle is. People do intelligence roll, different medicals. It gets to be a lot. I would recommend, not even as an umpire, but just as a general player, perhaps keep like a small list next to you. Like
Oh,
one through
most def.
four. Like remember to check unit supply lines. Remember to update units under siege. Remember to include winter effects. I think, kind of having these little keyword reminders for you off to the side, almost like a little index card, little, refresher for you every turn, because as the umpire, you are going to get overwhelmed, especially if it's your first time. Definitely have those little cheat cards next to you, because I can't tell you how many times we've played a game and just forgot to roll weather, which is perhaps one of the biggest outside factors that could affect the outcome of a battle. So especially when it comes to supply. So I think definitely keep those little cheat sheets next to you. Perhaps include some of those examples. Yeah.
Okay. Is I'm looking at my notes here for this. Is I also mentioned for like repercussive consequences on the campaign. What if you have a multi-part campaign? I know I keep harping on the Civil War one because that's one I'll be uh, umpiring. but like an East and West campaign, a Napoleonic campaign can. You've got at least what 10 years of stuff you can draw from there. You can make it a whole thing. Uh, what about some consequences for that? Like one army does really, really well here, or if it follows historically, they get the historical consequences. But what if it goes ahistorical and the South wins or the coalition wins? What about stuff like that for a multi-part campaign?
Yeah, I think we've definitely seen examples of that already. We're in our Middle Colonies campaign right now, and there's already some repercussions logistically that the Americans are dealing with because they lost New England. A big one I can think of is, a lot of the like ship manufacturing facilities in New England. Those are now mainly under British control, so the Americans have less. Like they already didn't have any naval power really to speak of, but now they even have some less so. Um,
I
the
go with I kept the
British,
army intact, so you're welcome.
yes, yes. Um, but also, now the British have like a main base of operations. Now they don't have to, purely rely on London. Now they kind of have a base where they can replenish with loyalists. In New England's, you look at the rest of the United States, New England doesn't look that big. But when you're talking about the campaign, like on the campaign, like New England it's pretty decent, and very population dense. So you have a logistical resupply of manpower as well, and now you don't have to wait for horses to be shipped all the way from England. Now you can just get replenished by the countryside. So I think, that's things that directly affect our current campaign is a campaign that we did like a year and a half ago.
Yeah.
Yeah, you really nailed it. Not only do the local resources of what you have access to wildly changes, you touched on it a little bit, but like the condition of the army, right? If even if you want to say, hey, we're going to jump to another theater, but this theater is going to continue. But let's say, hey, you know, the let's take Civil War and say, West East. Let's say in the East, um, Lee is making great strides. He's pushing hard, and the North needs all the help they can get. Suddenly, Northern ambitions to attack via the Tennessee River is probably not going to get nearly as much attention because of the issues in the East. And so you can do a lot with that depending on the conflict and what different theaters you're working with. But I think it definitely allows you to build upon kind of the unique direction your campaign may be making to kind of suddenly set a very different trajectory of the war.
I mean, I completely agree. As Caleb, you kind of just mentioned some foraging there, but what about supply chains versus foraging? How would the umpire be able to implement that into the campaign? Would that be more player dependent, umpire dependent? Where are we at on it?
I think, like as I mentioned before, umpires are going to be essential when you're wanting to include logistics in a campaign. And I think foraging versus organized supply lines. You definitely need to include the difference. So, for instance, we talk about we've mentioned the example before, Napoleon's invasion of Russia. It is reliant purely on logistics. I think Napoleon's I forget his title, but Berthier, Marshal Berthier, he was like the mastermind of logistics, and he's the one that helped his 1812 invasion of Russia. However, the Napoleonic army that goes through the Grand Army that invades Russia, it uses a mix of foraging and organized supply, but eventually gets so far from French-controlled territory that organized supply is too slow, and they have to start foraging. And so, not only are they foraging the Russian countryside, but the Russians are also burning their own countryside, so that way the French and her allies don't have any supply to grab. So by the time Napoleon gets to Moscow, like big whoop, I got the political victory, not actually, because the Russians upped and just abandoned the capital. So now he decides he has to retreat. However, he decides to retreat through the same territory that the Russians burned and that his army had stripped bare. So winter comes in, and now because of the lack of the organized supply lines, and the entire region has been completely either forged through or burned through the scorched earth policy. The French army, comes with the famous disaster of the retreat of Moscow, where the Grand Army is pretty much annihilated. So I think campaigns could definitely have a mix of organized and foraging. I think foraging it shouldn't be the army's main reliance on campaign, but it should definitely be an option. I think organized supply lines should probably be the rule of the day, especially depending on the time period. But I think foraging's like if you are relying on your army foraging to win a campaign, you are probably in a very bad strategic situation.
Yeah,
JT?
I mean, uh, not only is I would say it's probably the most situational thing, because if you're playing something maybe like if you're throwing a curveball and you're doing something like a Native American or
Oh
more
yeah.
uncentralized force, I guess, or something not quite as large, where the argument can be made that hey, maybe they are sustaining off of foraging, and standard supply lines aren't something they need. um that's something you can start looking at. um but I think in which case it's something you're really going to work out with everyone involved, because it's going to be a very different sort of set of rules to work with that. So yeah.
Okay. Is I agree with it. I don't think we've done foraging yet, but I know we have
Mm.
done a very abstract supply chain line. Very abstract. For our campaigns is most important thing though. What about the pieces on the battlefield, or do you do ghost forces? Is hey, I'm conducting a cavalry raid on the supply line between New York City and Boston, or New York City and wherever. I'm going to conduct a cav raid on that supply line. Do you fight that out on the tabletop? Do you use ghost forces and kind of roll? Or is it, again, that just comes down to empire dependent? Umpire dependent. I apologize. I've been watching a lot of Star Wars recently.
um, as far as me, when I umpire, every single engagement that could possibly happen, I give the players the opportunity to do it. Now, if both of the players say, no, I don't feel like wasting my time on this, let's just roll to see the outcome, I'm fine with that. But generally, I like to fight out every single engagement so that way the player feels as though they have had a say throughout the entire campaign. I know we kind of did something like that in our off-screen campaign, Southern Colonies, like around Pensacola, where we just rolled for that battle down there.
I think we did on our
Um,
on-screen one too, with some cav that may have found more cav and got scared.
yeah, so I mean, it's just dependent, if both forces decide they don't want to fight it out, and that's fine. But I definitely think you need to include the markers on the campaign map to show, like, because then that helps the umpire kind of envision, like, okay, this route has been closed off. I see this British cavalry marker right here, so clearly that route's cut off. So that way, whenever I go to talk to the American player, I can give them a bit more of an accurate reading of, okay, so this is how your supply line was cut, and this is the location where. So that's kind of where I fall.
Yeah, I haven't had the chance to umpire myself, so I can't speak quite from that point of view. But I would imagine like a lot of this it's very personal dependent. But I think once again it's situational. If it's something where hey, we know we're gonna lose, but our goal is hey, we're gonna try and cripple enough of their units before we go down that we want to fight it, even though it's arguably hopeless. You can certainly do stuff like that. Just at the very least, having the option to fight it or to do something about a very unbalanced situation at least gives your players the opportunity to do something a little weird or do something crazy that the person that thinks they have the upper hand probably didn't think about.
I completely agree with that. I kind of like doing the Ghost Forces one personally. For if it's just a supply train that's undefended, because why set the whole battlefield up? That takes time, and I'd rather get to the bigger battles for the campaign that are a lot more fun. But here's another one I was just thinking of, and I think Caleb had said it, or maybe it was UJT, and I apologize that I can't remember. Is you're talking about letting the player know and everything, but what if the town has been surrounded on all sides? Roads are all cut, no supplies getting in, and that player had no clue that they had been surrounded, their fort, their city, their etc. Whatever. How would you explain that to the player? Like all of a sudden, hey, you've
Ooh.
got 2 turns, 5 turns, whatever.
Well, we haven't really had something like that happen yet, and I'm kind of looking forward to that. But let's say in your scenario, let's say a British division manages to surround an American regiment in a town. So therefore, no supplies can get in or out, but also information, couriers. So if the American player came to me and said, "Hey, I would like to move this regiment," and I would say, um, you haven't heard from this regiment. I think that would probably clue them in that, okay, there's an issue going on here. And then once they come to the point where they're like, oh, they're surrounded, clearly, then I would be like, okay, yes, they've been surrounded. They've actually been surrounded for about a week now. Um, and this is how much time they relatively think. I don't like giving exact things because, anything could happen. Men could die of disease. More men could enter the town to, kind of change up how much supply. So, but I give a rough timeline of this is, the commander of that force that is besieged or is now having to ration supplies. This is about how much time he believes this unit has before they start taking attrition due to supply inadequacies.
I got you. JT, any thoughts?
Yeah, I really don't have anything to add to that. You kind of hit the nail on the head there.
Is Yeah, I was gonna say the only time I think I've ever seen a fort be completely surrounded was the Northern Colonies campaign. Is Boston got surrounded, but we were attacked. What, a day after being surrounded, if that? We were attacked that
Mhm.
turn, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, there wasn't really time for attrition to really dig its claws in for that one.
Is No, these are some good points there. I think it just comes down to, just to recap, get a good umpire who understands a lot of stuff. You gotta, read history, which is probably already your interest if you're doing this and listening to this podcast. Is understand history, just go with it from there, and then understanding some form of a supply chain. Try to incorporate that in your game. Um, I don't know what advice we'd give new players on this one though, because this is a abstract one we even struggle with. Caleb, do you have any advice you could give a new player? Think of any.
Yeah, I would say it's almost impossible to do logistics as a standalone player. You need at least 3 players. You need the 2 opposing players and your umpire. I think it's very difficult to include those logistical restraints with just 2, even though it is possible if you do it in like an arcade game. But I think at the end of the day, it comes down to, this is a bit more of a complex topic that could go in so many different routes. Um, I just think that whichever, whoever the umpire is, they need to decide, okay, how detailed am I going to go into my logistics? What factors determine logistics? Was that am I only looking at weather? Am I looking at sieges? Am I looking at crop rotations? Is
Yeah,
wheat in season? So therefore, can this army, can they forage? Is corn in season at this point? So can the army actually forage anything? So I think the umpire can get as in depth or as simple with logistics as he wants, but personal opinion, you cannot do campaigns as we do it. We try to do a 1-to-1 scale to make it as realistic as possible. You can't do that with a factor that basically forced what commanders did at the time, which is logistics. Logistics forced them to, either halt a campaign or, start a campaign at a certain point of the year. due to logistics. So you just need to include some element of that if you're planning on campaigning.
Yeah, you'd never know if you have Italian troops who need water and pasta. Apparently, JT, any
very important.
parting thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, don't overcomplicate it starting out. I mean, it's a lot more difficult. It's more annoying to overcomplicate it and then have to adhere to your own rules. And it's a lot easier to keep it simple and say, hey, this is easy enough for us to manage. Let's throw this on top. Let's start talking about the effects of the season. Let's start talking about, hey, what about food? What about go little at a time, and kind of find where your sweet spot is. Because it's a lot easier to deal with something that you feel like could be more complex than to kind of adjust when you feel you've started too far in the first place.
I agree. This will be coming out on the 24th. If you haven't already, definitely go and watch episode 2 of our Middle Colony. Should be coming out on the 17th, if I'm not mistaken. But other than that, I'll see y'all next time. We'll be talking fortifications. Am I correct on that one, gentlemen?
Yes.
As far as I know.
Yes, we will be talking fortifications, and our good friend JT actually works at a fort, so he should have lots of insight. Alrighty, until next time.
That's it for today's episode. For battles, brushes, and everything in between, make sure you subscribe and join the community. Until next time, Generals, see you on the tabletop.